Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, if he ever builds a Bilbo deck, he's going to fill it with a ton of new adventure cards. It's Matt Morgan.
Joey, this weekend, absolutely crazy. I was so surprised. I had Rick Astley as my waiter. It was so amazing, but turns out he was a really bad waiter. No matter how bad I asked and said, I really want this, he just wouldn't desert me.
Yeah. Okay, you know what? I thought I knew where you were going with that one, and I was like, I'm pretty sure we've heard all of the Rick Astley jokes that could ever possibly exist, but that one threw me. So you know what? Well done, actually. I'm all about that.
I can't get over Rick Astley jokes. You might say I just can't give them up. So
okay, that one I have heard before.
That one you have heard, but I still like it. So you're gonna have to deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. All right, up next, he knows it's not possible, but he's still trying to find a way to put all of those new role tokens onto a single creature. It's Dana Roach.
I'm pretty pumped about the newest build I have. I think it's pretty good, and when I showed it to a mime friend of mine, he was speechless. I think he was really impressed by like how I was thinking outside the box.
Listeners, you can't see, but Dana's doing the mime gesticulations right now, and it's like that's
cute.
Incredible.
It is cute.
You guys are too much for me sometimes. All right, Matt, what are we talking about on this episode this week?
So this week, we're going to kind of give ourselves a little history lesson and go through the different eras and kind of define what they really could have been as far as the eras of Commander design.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. It is a little bit of a history lesson, but I think it's very interesting to go over the years that Commander has not been a thing and then been a thing, and identify different moments, products, specific times, years, and stuff like that, where like, oh, here was a shift in the way that the company and the player base were engaging with what Commander would eventually become. I'm really excited for this, but we got to do some shout outs before we hop to it.
First, I'd like to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves, for helping editing the show, and you can find them online at Mana Curves.
We also wanted to let you know we'll be at the Magic Summit this year in Salt Lake City, October 26th to 29th. We had an absolute blast last year, and we hope to see you fine folks again this year. Come say hi and get in some games with us at the Magic Summit. And you may see us there in our Coalesce apparel Magic-themed merch, which you can also get. And no matter what you get from Coalesce, use code EDHREC at checkout for 10% off your order. They have all types of way cool designs, from the Omnath Rock and Royal shirt to, of course, the EDHREC collection, which you may see us sporting at the Magic Summit event. Once again, that's Coalesce and code EDHREC for 10% off your order.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking, subscribing to this video on YouTube. You can subscribe on your local podcast app, or you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see the episodes a day early, where we typically steal the segue. At least you can do that a day early. Or there's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly patron shoutout, which this week we are going to give a very special shout out to Josh Brubaker Salcedo. So Brubaker Salcedo is such an impressive last name, then it's preceded by Josh.
that is a very outweighed on one side versus the other in terms of names. But like, Josh has been a patron of ours for like 3 years. So like, Josh, thank you so much for the support, the ongoing support for that long. That is so tremendous of you. Seriously, thank you.
I want to say thank you, Brubaker Salcedo, because that sounds so much more impressive.
That does, like, yeah, that sounds, honestly, Josh, I hope this doesn't feel, that sounds like a gazoon-tite. It sounds like if someone sneezes, I should say, oh, Brubaker Salcedo. If someone sneezes, I should be like Mariska Hargitay. You know, it sounds like it's that kind of a name. Anyway, I think I'm stealing that joke from someone anyway, but let's get to it. Thank you again, Josh, so much for your ongoing support. It means the world. And now, guys, we're going to get into our topic. We are talking, we are defining the eras of Commander design. And Dana, as our oldest friend, I didn't mean to say it that way.
Yes, you did. Yes,
it's just an automatic. It just automatically happens. So Dana, as the dinosaur amongst us, that one I did mean to say. What was the very first place that we're going to start with for Commander eras?
Well, the first thing I guess we'll note is there was an era where there really wasn't a thing called Commander or even the concept, because there weren't legendary creatures. Alpha didn't have legends, and the first 2 expansions, Arabian Nights and Antiquities, didn't have legendary creatures. So the entire concept of legendary creatures, which is what Commander needs to exist, didn't even begin until Legends, which was about 2 years into Magic's existence. So we're going to kind of count, I guess it doesn't really make much sense to talk about that kind of alpha phase before anything existed. So I guess we decided to call it the pre-DH period.
Yeah.
And we kind of have defined that as before 2011. So from Legends up until basically before that first batch of precons came out is kind of that first phase where from when Commander went from basically Highlander was a format that kind of casual people played early on until it became, the thing known as Commander later on, or as EDH later on. That's kind of this first giant phase that we want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, originally when the format was in its early infant steps, it was just kind of the Elder Dragons. You had the Nicol Bolas, you had all of those original Elder Dragons that kind of had to helm the deck, and that's what everything was based around. But it was kind of a weird format. Cards weren't that great compared to what we're seeing today. And so cards like Rhystic Study weren't really all that balanced in what kind of Commander was in its original form.
Yeah, definitely a lot of designs looking through the past, and it's like, I don't think that would fly today now that Multiplayer Matters design is like such a huge focus. And it's just like, some of these cards are a little bit cracked. But that also, like, even beyond just the original Elder Dragons, this was also, like, when they did start making more and more Legends, they weren't specifically designed for Commander players, but, this was back when Alara, for example, was like a treasure trove of Legends, because we got stuff like Shroom the Hegemon, which was just accidentally a very, very good commander. This was back when Zur the Enchanter was like a powerhouse tutory commander, or back when like the Niv Mizzet Firemind combo with Curiosity was still a novelty to everyone. So like this was, these cards were just accidentally really, really good commanders, but it was slim pickings by far.
Yeah, and I guess some things to note about this phase, the commanders that were good were accidentally good. Yeah. It's like no one was building these cards to be good in a multiplayer 40 life format. You would just occasionally stumble across the Zur the Enchanter, like that got mentioned, or the Shroom, or the Rafik of the Many, cards that just happened to work really well in this format, but nobody intended them to do that. And I think the other thing worth noting about this era too is win conditions were really thin.
Yes.
There's a reason, one of the reasons Zur was so good and one of the reasons Shroom was so good is they were combo engines baked into the commander. And combo was kind of probably the best. You could say it's the best way to win today, but at least there's alternatives today. At the time, there just weren't a lot of alternatives other than hope you have a 4/4 out when someone's at 4 life.
Yeah.
There were a couple of overrun effects, but for the most part, your win conditions were just get lucky with combat damage or to combo out. And we've seen a lot of diversity since those days in a whole bunch of different ways, but things were much more narrow back in that 2011 and earlier era.
For sure.
Well, and if you look at like the pre-modern format, which is kind of one of those community-run formats as well, it's a lot like that. It's real weird win conditions. It's really specific synergies. And then the card advantage engines, those also just don't really exist in the same way that they do today either. So getting any sort of card selection, and that was really hard to do if you weren't playing blue. And so it kind of was the Wild West when you think about it, as far as how people were coming about just learning about the format, even because it really wasn't all that common for such a long time, even though folks that were playing it had been playing it for a while.
For sure, yeah. And like nowadays, people who are a little nostalgic for that era, Matt, I think you've got a pre-DH deck yourself, where it's just like, hey, I want to play in a pod where it's just like we're only using cards from back in this specific time. I think specifically the cutoff is like Scars of Mirrodin or something like that. Yep. And that's just a place where you can be like, oh, these are all some much older cards, and this feels like a very different creature than what Commander has become today.
Yeah, I have a Sig River Guide pre-EDH deck, and it's a lot of fun. It's nice to be able to go back, and when I got back into Magic, it was around the Theros time, so it was still after the Commander precons had been coming out, but the cards that I had from when I was a kid fell into this era, and so it was a chance to just play one of those nostalgia-driven formats, and I very much I enjoy it. It's nice just to be able to struggle a little bit. The training wheels definitely are not there when it comes to how you get to win a games, but yeah, it's fun. It's a good deck.
So the next era is after they started designing Commander products, and it's just those two eras. That's the end of the show. If everyone wants to find us on socials, you can look at. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Moving on, I personally feel like the next thing is actually not so much an era as like a standalone moment. I don't think it ties into the pre-DH moment, and I also don't think that it ties necessarily into the stuff that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But the introduction of the Commander 2011 product with Mimiplasm, with Gave, with all of those, Kalia, all of those things first coming out, that feels to me almost like its own standalone thing, particularly because we didn't get a set of Commander precons in 2012 the following year. This was a very test the waters moment that I think makes it standalone in isolation. And so, I don't know, to me it feels very first season of RuPaul's Drag Race, and we're not sure if this is actually going to work. And so we're just sort of like testing out some of these waters and seeing how it goes. So to me, the Commander 2011 product is kind of its own thing that doesn't belong to the future and doesn't belong to the past.
It's a strange little window where you have a handful of commanders that are really good in kind of the modern version of what we see today. Kali the Vast is still a very solid commander. Mimioplasm is still a very solid commander.
What up?
There are some things that were designed in this window that still hold up today, but they also didn't quite get what the format would eventually be. I shouldn't say they didn't understand it, but like where it's evolved. At the time, there was a whole lot of cards in there that seemed to work under the notion that everyone would like pool their resources. So there was joined forces cards and stuff. So from the design point of view, it seemed to feel like everyone was going to be really friendly in terms of like building up their armies in a way that really hasn't been how Commander has shaped out.
And how wrong were they with that assumption?
Right. Yeah. So it's an interesting window to see what the vision of the format, what they thought it was going to be, and the places they hit and the places they missed. And once you get to that kind of next era, you can see that they realize what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, I think so. This was also the time where we were still getting designs like Spell Crumple, because remember how Commander tucking used to be a thing?
Yep.
So just like, rules were a little bit different. But also not just in terms of the precon itself, but like around this time too, like in the 2010, 2011 sort of moment of design, that was when we were also still getting cards like Exsanguinate or Serra Ascendant. And Exsanguinate draining everyone and you gain that much life total that was drained. That's not the kind of design that they make anymore today. Instead, it would just be everyone loses that much life and you gain that much life. Or Serra Ascendant, which has a big buff if you have more than 25 life. Well, in a format where you start with 40 life, it automatically gets all of the huge big buffs. And those are also the types of designs that they wouldn't do today. So paying very close attention to multiplayer, like how these types of designs in standard sets would affect multiplayer, also is not necessarily forefront on the mind, I think.
Well, and we also were coming out of kind of one of the most powerful eras of constructed Magic at the time too. You know, we just had Cobblade formats, and so now all of a sudden we're into Delver in standard, where that was another very kind of high-powered standard format where it was very skill testing. And so one thing that I think really helped out the popularity of a casual format was it was a break from this very, very hyper-tuned standard format, which standard has been the most popular format pretty much through the existence or type 2, whatever you want to call all the old formats. But standard has largely been one of the most played formats. And so all of a sudden you had a break from standard and extended and legacy and everything, playing this fun casual format. And I think that's really what helped, because I mean, Innistrad standard was so packed with a lot of just very, very dense decks. And so being able to get a break from that probably helped the popularity of Commander, just was that kind of perfect storm.
Well, there was also just in a general sense, a huge influx of new players from basically Innistrad onward. Mm-hmm. That was kind of their first experiment with this set that like resonated outside of the Magic community. It was playing with a lot of these horror tropes that were really well known by the average person. And that there was a big increase in the amount of packs they sold to new players, starting with Innistrad, and it kind of ramped upward from that point on. But that was that break point. So you had a bunch of things happening simultaneously. You were coming off a really strong standard. You were moving into a standard where all of a sudden they were selling a lot of packs to people that hadn't played Magic beforehand. And you're seeing commanders start to happen at the same time. So all of those things were occurring simultaneously. And that's a lot of directions for design to have to look at the same time.
Very, very much. So yeah, that is sort of its own standalone thing. But then comes, like, we didn't get a Commander Precon product in 2012. But eventually we did again in 2013. And that, I think, marks the beginning of a new era. Matt, how was this one defined?
So this one, I would guess that you can probably define it as when they finally started realizing that you can do different things out of the command zone. Because if you look at some of the, especially the pre-constructed decks that they had that first came out in the 2013 decks, there was a lot that had to do with the command zone, whether it was Derevi, which was that super, super popular Bant commander that you could cheat the mana or the commander tax and just putting the card just out of the command zone, which hadn't been done before. But then you also had stuff like Prosh, Sky Raider of Kur, which was the Jund commander that the more times you cast it, the more times you got to make a huge army of kobolds. And so very, very quickly they realized, oh, maybe this was pushing it a little too far too fast.
I think that this era for us is kind of limited within like 2013 up to like 2015, and it's a lot of the designs, like legendary creatures, especially at the faces of precons, really had a lot of experiments. Like 2013, we had those where they were messing around with the command zone in different ways, but in 2014 we got planeswalkers as commanders. In 2015 we got experience counters, another thing that you can't interact with in its own different zone as well. And that just like, yeah, like they started playing around not just with the command zone, but also like starting to be like, let's try a few other things in this multiplayer format. Let's see what we can do. And we got like random curses in the deck. Like, I think that they still needed some time to figure out multiplayer matters cards at this point. Like we were getting like Curse of the Forsaken, which is like, oh, whenever you attack this person, you gain 1 life. And I'm like, that's not very good. So like some of the card designs in the 99 were still very hit and miss. But in terms overall of like what we were getting here was like 1 precon set a year with some experiments beginning to occur.
Yeah, I think the notable thing about this particular era is it's the first time when they realized we can do things with these commanders unique to this format.
Yeah.
I mentioned Kali the Vast being still a really good card today and Mimeoplasm still being really good, but there's nothing intrinsic about those card designs that says commander. Kalia could very easily have been a card in Alara that just so happened to be a good commander card. Same thing with Mimeoplasm. There's nothing about those that screamed commander. They just happen to be good in commander.
Sure.
Whereas this 2013 through 2015 era, it's their first time when they're really playing in that space and kind of feeling out, oh, we can do things that are specific and commander niche based. So what does that look like? And they're kind of feeling that out. And there's misses and there's hits, but that's to me what defines this era is the realization that they can like do things they hadn't done before because this is a space that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Well, and a little bit of kind of pushback, I guess, against that comment, Dana, or maybe more building off of it, however you want to frame it. I don't think it was their first chance to design for a commander because they did a pre-constructed deck block, whatever you want to call it beforehand, but it was their first chance to design for commander now that they kind of understood just fundamentally what commander even was. Because beforehand, I think they just kind of said, well, let's just do this and we'll see what happens. But they had a chance to kind of reevaluate. This was a couple years later. And so now they started to get cards that were planted for non-standard formats. And that's really what kind of messed things up a little bit in the eyes of 60-card players because yes, we got Bane of Progress, but then you had cards like Toxic Deluge and True Name Nemesis and Baleful Strix that all of a sudden, those were just legacy staples from the instant that they were introduced.
And in some cases, intentionally so.
Yes.
Because it's easy to, if you weren't around back then, it's easy to maybe not realize this. There just weren't a lot of venues to print cards that would work for Eternal formats that wouldn't destroy Standard. And it was there wasn't a Modern Masters kind of environment. Basically, your chance to print a card to balance an Eternal format without messing up Standard was Commander. So we get things like Flusterstorm and Trinity Nemesis popping up in Commander that weren't necessarily that good at Commander cards and were absolute bombs in other formats, because that was the way to introduce cards for those formats because nothing else existed. Yeah. So we're used to a world today where everything is a way to introduce cards to Commander. There was this weird little window where Commander was a way to introduce cards to other formats.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to bring up Flusterstorm as well, because that really felt like a safety net for the first Commander 2011 product of just like, let's put this here, because we know that at least the 60 card constructed folks are really going to go for this one in case this whole Commander thing is a total flop.
Yeah,
and True Name Nemesis, Matt, that you brought up, also totally the same. Toxic Deluge, certainly a powerhouse card in Commander, but like, let's be real, Legacy has been like, ever since it saw that card.
Yes.
And we did get some of those gems like Bane of Progress, which still are really great to this day. But it was still a lot of like the experimentation of like what's good in Commander, and we're sort of hedging our bets by having these other cards planted for other formats in here as well, because we know for sure that those are popular, and we'll see what we can try out with this whole Commander thing. So that's what this 2013 to 2015 era feels like to me, is a hedging the bets experiment type of timeline.
Yeah, Modern Horizons as a set and concept wouldn't exist if it weren't for how Commander and the pre-constructed decks really worked in this time.
Mm-hmm.
And to get a little bit meta here, beyond just the cards being printed, this was the era where people really began to dig back through Magic's history for cards that were really good in Commander that had kind of been forgotten before.
Sure.
This was the era when Rhystic Study really became a thing. Mm-hmm. Not that it hadn't seen play before, but like this was the window where our shops actually began putting them in their cases because Commander players wanted them. This was the era where people were like, I had a store here locally in town that was talking about how they would sell 20 strip mines a week. And they, 2 years earlier, they wouldn't sell one a month. But Commander players were buying these $3 strip mines, which is what they cost at the time, to put in their Commander decks, because they were digging back these old cards that hadn't seen any previous play. And that really started to take off in this window when people were basically mining Magic's history for stuff that would work in Commander.
So listeners now, they just wouldn't believe this if you weren't playing back then. But Cyclonic Rift was a bulk rare.
Yeah,
Cyclonic Rift, you would open it in a pack and you would be disappointed. And absolutely, it was a time to just dig through all of your bulk boxes. It was probably the last time that Commander was a bulk rare format, and it was fantastic. But yeah, it's really cool to dig through history and see what you could have found back then. Kind of like you dig through history and see all the times we've stolen the Challenge of Stats segue from Joey.
Crying out loud.
Nice.
Historical precedent.
I wanted to talk about the next era of 2016 and conspiracy stuff onward so bad, but
which we can do
after
we take a quick break.
Oh man, you know what? I'm actually pulling down the curtain here. I'm pulling, like, Matt Foley in our show notes, in our document right now, he was just like, oh, I've got something off of what Dana just said, to be like, oh, okay, then I'll wait for Matt to talk.
And
he did have something to say. But it turned out what he was going to say was a ham-fisted segue into Challenge of Stats, because I'm not allowed to do that. So Matt has resorted not just to like the verbal trickery, but also like even the cues that we use to make the show just kind of flow better. Matt was like abusing the fact that we share a Google Doc in order to steal the segue.
Nice.
Listeners, he goes so extra for you all, and I hope you appreciate it, because crying out loud.
I'm a man of the people. I give the people what they want.
All right, there's a lot of data on EDHREC, but don't always agree with it, so we'll come right back after this break. Bye, everyone!
College football fans, are you ready for week 1? DraftKings Sportbook is hooking you up with a can't-miss offer to start the season strong. This week, new customers can bet just $5 in college football and score $200 in bonus bets instantly. Anything can happen in college football. Is this the year we finally see a Artificers Academy or maybe a mage school win the national championship? Who knows? All I know is that change comes fast, and the only thing that's a lock is the great offers from DraftKings Sportsbook. Life's more fun when you're in on the action. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code EDH. New customers can score $200 in bonus bets instantly when they bet just $5 in college football. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with code EDH. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling at 888-789-777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. 21 plus age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. See dkng.co/football for eligibility, terms, and responsible gaming resources. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance, and eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. So my challenge this week is for Zerium Golden Wind decks. For those who don't recall, that's the legendary Griffin we got from back in Dominaria United. It's a 3/4 with flying for 4 mana, 3 and a white. And it says, whenever a Griffin you control deals combat damage to a player, create a 2/2 white Griffin creature token with flying. That's actually a pretty solid commander. The problem with that deck being, number one, it's mono white. Number two, every Griffin is just terrible. But you know what? There are bodies with flying. You can get through it. It actually winds up being a much better deck than you would think. And one of the reasons it's a much better deck than you would think is because the trigger on Zerium Golden Wind is whenever a Griffin you control deals combat damage to a player, you create a 2/2 white Griffin creature token. There's no text here that says once a turn, and you can trigger that off double strike twice. So my challenge here is for Duelist Heritage, which is currently just showing up in 18% of Zerium the Golden Wind decks. Duelist Heritage is a standalone enchantment. It's not an aura, so you don't have to risk getting 2 for 1 like with Battle Mastery. And you could just give a creature double strike during combat. And we've talked in the past about how useful that is to just give your opponent's creatures, when they aren't swinging at you, double strike. It's fantastic. But in this deck, it's also really good because it lets you make twice as many Griffins, and twice as many Griffins then make twice as many Griffins next turn when they hit somebody. Having the ability to just double proc that in this deck is really, really useful. True Conviction's in about 60% of these decks, and it absolutely should be because it affects all your Griffins, but you just always want to have a double strike enabler out. You know, you probably don't want to have like 4 or 5 of them in the deck because they don't stack, but having a backup plan is really good, and Duelist Heritage is the best backup plan to True Conviction you can be running, and it should be in more than 18% of these Zerium decks.
I like that redundancy a lot, especially because Zerium is pretty cheap to cast, and True Conviction can you can even sandbag that one as like a late game, no one sees it coming kind of finisher.
Yeah.
But more importantly, Duelist Heritage is the kind of thing that like this will help me actually get the strategy off the ground earlier, as opposed to True Conviction, which I can't cast until much later when I've got some stuff already established. So I really, really like that one. Duelist Heritage, really cool design. Zerium, also, I really like that design too. So I look forward to being heritaged by any Zerium players that I come across. I'll go to my challenge here, and I've got an overplayed challenge for a relatively new commander. Julodok Void Gorger is the colorless face commander from the new Eldrazi Unbound precon. It's a very spicy card, 6 mana, 7/4 legendary creature Eldrazi, and colorless spells that you cast from your hand with mana value of 7 or greater have 2 instances of Cascade. So if you play a 7-drop, you'll flip until you find, say, the top 4-drop, and also the top 5-drop of your deck or something like that. This is a very, very spicy commander. I gotta push back against one of the cards that's showing up on its page, though. In about 27-28% of Julodok decks, we're seeing Endless One show up in these decks, and I don't think that 28% of the 3,800 Julodok players out there should be playing this one. Endless One is an X cost 0/0 that enters with X+1 counters on it. We've talked about it before. When you're cascading and you cascade into a thing, like X is going to be 0. So you will get a total cascade whiff off of this. You will play it. It will be a 0/0. It will immediately die. Don't play this one in Julodok decks. If you like Eldrazi, totally understand. That's really cool. And yes, you can cast this one for 7 if it's in your hand, but the likeliest scenario is that you're going to cascade into this and totally whiff when you could have gotten something really, really cool instead. So take this one out of your Julodok decks. That is my challenge.
Yep. Age-old favorite. Don't play X-Spells in your Cascade decks.
X-Spells in Cascade, pretty dangerous.
Still don't do it. Yep. So I'll move into my challenge then. So mine is submitted to us by a listener who went to patreon.com/EDHRECast, join our Discord community, and then we have a channel specifically for challenging stats. And so Trogdonite is their username. Good on ya, Trogdonite. But they had a really good comment, a really good catch for overplayed cards, which we always appreciate seeing. So Trogdonite commented that they want to challenge stats for Nikki of the Old Ways decks, or really any deck running Primal Surge. If you're playing Primal Surge as more than just a value piece to get a few permanents, you can't run any other cards that draw you a card when they enter the battlefield. Otherwise, you're going to deck yourself. So they mentioned specifically cards like Elemental Bond, Guardian Project. Those aren't may abilities. Garruk's Uprising is not a you may draw a card. It is you have to draw a card. So when you're looking at all these cards in these Primal Surge decks, and when you look at Nikki of the Old Ways, the page for the commander, over a third of the decks are playing Primal Surge as a way to generate a ton of value. So what you want to be sure of when you're building the deck is not being mindful of when you're going to cast that Primal Surge. If you're going to put those Garruk's Uprisings, those Guardian Projects into the battlefield, you're going to end up decking yourself if you're playing the Oops All Permanents version of the deck. So be very mindful of that. Garruk's Uprising is being played in 12% of these Nikia decks. And the typical deck isn't playing a ton of non-creatures because of Nikia's ability that says you can't play non-creature spells, but there still is going to be at least a few in every given deck. So make sure you're mindful of when you're casting these Primal Surges, because every now and then we see it happen, and it's just like, well, you kind of knew what was going to happen. So this is a really good catch. Thank you for the submission, Trogdonite. It's always good to hear from our listeners. And again, patreon.com/EDHRECast if you want to submit your own challenges.
Ayo. Yeah, Garruk's Uprising. I just looked at the page for Primal Surge, and Garruk's Uprising shows up in 22% of decks that contain Primal Surge. Guardian Project shows up in 19% of decks that contain Primal Surge. And it's just like, yeah, watch out, because like they're great value engines, but if you're playing a dedicated Primal Surge deck, they could kill you. So like, be careful.
Okay, so back to the main topic here. I think the next kind of split we want to delve into is 2016, when we got Conspiracy Take the Crown. And that feels like it kind of marks the beginning of multiplayer matters when it comes to design.
Yeah. I think this one, to my estimation, this next like slot of time is like between 2016 up to 2018. But yeah, this is where we got like not just one-off precons a year, but also like full-on multiplayer matters sets like Battle Bond and Conspiracy, the introduction of the Monarch. We had abilities like Goad and Melee, Will of the Council, things like that. Like we really got like, okay, some true attention is now being paid to the way that multiplayer games go, and we're no longer getting some of those silly curses that, or those Join Forces cards that you were talking about, Dana. We're getting some stuff that's just like, oh, the Monarch, like the lean forward, we are compelled by this, and there's some stuff that was made here that lingers with us to this day in its like ingenuity with how it interfaces with multiplayer Magic.
Yeah, and in the pre-constructed decks too, they still continue to push the boundaries as far as what can commanders do. I know a lot of folks don't love Eminence, but they were like, okay, how can we have commanders kind of make an impact without actually being on the battlefield? And so that's when we started to see the creature type matters pre-constructed decks. Those were a big one. But we also had partners. How many commanders can you put in the command zone?
Yeah.
And that also that continued to evolve too. So there was a lot. It wasn't just how people are playing with multiplayer formats. How are people playing with the command zone as well? And there was a lot of experimentation going on that has ripple effects moving forward.
That is totally true. I think like, to me, at least in this era though, it still very much felt like the specific place that I would want to go to for commanders was still like in the commander precons. Those were still the most engaging things to me. And we didn't always, like in standard sets, the legends were not always geared quite as compellingly towards the commander players. Like this time window is where we got the Ulrich disaster for all those werewolf players who were just like, oh, we'll finally get a werewolf legend, and then it was Ulrich of the Kralin Horde.
Then they did not finally get a werewolf commander.
Right. So there was still that disconnect where like, and to be honest, like in hindsight, there are pieces of that where I'm just like, thank goodness that they weren't like paying too much attention to commander in standard sets. But at the same time, like just it felt like there was a severe disparity between the legends that we would get in pre-constructed decks versus the legends that we would get in commander decks. I felt like the Gishaths were more of a one-off rarity, and the Ulrichs were more of a common situation in standard constructed sets.
Yeah, I think this was the era where commander players first started to expect WotC to give them treats in every single set for the most part.
Uh-oh.
Kind of.
Dana, that was troublingly worded.
Yeah, well, in the Elric is a good example of that. Like, lots of people were kind of frustrated that card wasn't designed in a way to be really good in Commander. And I think this is a really good example, because I think we're going to come back to this in the very near future, where maybe getting what you thought you wanted isn't always the best thing. A lot of people thought they wanted WotC to design cards specifically for Commander, and I'm not saying it's bad that they did necessarily, but getting what you want has impacts that perhaps people didn't anticipate back when they were mad they didn't have their Werewolf Commander.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there, but
Yes, there is.
but to build off of it, so Dana alluded to something that we're going to talk about here in a second, but this was the last time that in standard legal sets, we were getting less than 10 legendary creatures per set. We didn't.
Yeah.
Ravnica Allegiance is the last set with single-digit legendary creatures. And Ravnica Allegiance, I remember that block when the third time I want to say that we went to Ravnica, was a very, very good set for Commander players. There were a lot of really good cards in there. There were some very interesting legends.
Yeah.
But there just wasn't a ton of legends in there. But the legends that we did get were really cool. Like, we had Teysa Karlov. We had a lot of really cool things in this era when it comes to the legendary creatures that we were given.
Yeah, and one thing I think that impacts the next layer of design, the next wedge we'll get into from this one, is the Commander card they designed with Commander in mind in other sets that became very popular. You mentioned Teysa as a really good example. That became a very popular card, and it's a very powerful Commander. And I think that's the kind of thing the Wizards of the Coast, in terms of design, took notice of. This was something that is powerful in Commander, that was very popular, and I think they set out to replicate that in a lot of ways from this point moving forward.
Yeah, so if there was a lot to unpack about that, now we're getting into the next one, and there's even more to unpack here, because y'all, we're getting into 2019. Matt, you mentioned Ravnica Allegiance was one of the last times, if not the last time, that we saw a single-digit number of legends in a set. Well, around there, right after that, was War of the Spark, Throne of Eldraine, the Brawl Precons, Modern Masters, all of which sported like at minimum 20 legends per set or something like that. And this was where we really got to see, Dana, as you were talking about, some powerhouse designs. And I think that's kind of how we've defined this particular era, 2019 and 2020. That's where they officially began Fire design, as they call it, which stood for fun, inviting, replayable, and exciting. And they really pushed an envelope. They really made some designs that are still wreaking havoc to this day.
They pushed all the envelopes to the point where this is when the United States Postal Service also started struggling.
Wow!
That's how many envelopes were pushed in this era of design.
Yeah, so okay, we've all heard of Corvold and Tulane, but like that's also where we got Golos. That's also where we got Kenrith. This is also where we got like Urza, like this is like, oof, okay, there's some stuff happening.
Yeah, I think this is the point where there's an intentionality to the cards that are designed, where someone behind the scenes is specifically saying, this card is going to sell packs to Commander players because they are going to want to get this very playable and very powerful card to build a deck around. And I think this is really the first time we are seeing that in other sets, where instead of seeding Flusterstorm into Commander for Legacy players, they're seeding cards into Standard for Commander players, with the intent that Commander players will seek these things out for their Commander decks.
Well, not only that, they're seeding Commander into Standard because they tried the whole companion thing in Ikoria. Right. They're like, let's literally bring an aspect of Commander into other constructed venues. Gee, what an idea that was. This is where I think a lot of the focus on EDH got so intense that it really became a point of disregarding some of the health of the other formats out there. And I know that a lot of constructed players don't like that. For the record, Commander players didn't like it either.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the argument can be made that disregarding it for the sake of Commander wasn't healthy for Commander in some way.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and my biggest struggle too, and to be very clear, this is not taking a shot at anybody and their skills in card design, because we've said many times how difficult it is to design cards in a healthy format. But I think that a lot of folks that were designing Commander-specific cards in this era didn't actually play Commander themselves, or they weren't fans of the format. You can tell with some of the legendary creature designs, it was how would a 60-card competitive player approach designing a card and then put it in the command zone. And that's when we saw a lot of these designs where everything was so pushed to what was at the time an unhealthy level. Now, the rest of the format has caught up to what a lot of the legends were doing in this era. But for a time there, it was almost play these specific commanders or you're putting yourself at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and there are ways where I'm just like, there were things here that I got that I had always wanted. So I struggle to look at this always as a negative. Like War of the Spark is where we got Feather, one of my beloved commanders. That is a deck that I have since taken apart. But like at long last, I finally had a commander for a character that I'd loved from the novelizations, and it was like, oh, this is wonderful, thank goodness. And she's also like decent. This is like a slight foray away from what Boros has normally been doing for all of this time. So I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. But everything else that also came along with that was just very difficult to swallow at the same time. Although one other thing that I'll note that I don't think was necessarily a bad thing here, but like in this 2019-2020 era, like the Ikoria precons were also the first time that the precons were lining up with the main sets rather than being random, like, oh, you know, whatever was happening in 2016, Atraxa was not connected to the main set necessarily. So like that was also an interesting shift that we started to see as a lot of those design venues started to come together, and that in general, I'm actually like, oh, that was at least kind of a cool thing. I think that the fact that there were Fierce Guardianship level cards in those precons was maybe not as cool of a thing, but the fact that things were lining up and there was some synergy there, I'm like, that is something I do appreciate.
Yeah. So to back up just a little bit, I do want to point out that I think Wizards of the Coast and the design team in general, between this 2016 era, so the previous era that we were talking about with Conspiracy, Take the Crown, and this current one here, they learned a lot of very, very valuable lessons that benefit the designs that we got after this. So just because of the delay that we always see within, you know, a new set is released and they're going to take those notes, they're going to learn lessons from what happened and what went wrong, especially, and then they're going to fix that moving forward. It takes about 2 years from when a card is, or from when a set is released until they're able to design the next set that they're able to kind of take that feedback. So the lessons that were learned in this time span were extremely valuable for the future health of the format. And I do want to give a lot of credit to how a lot of the feedback that players gave to Wizards of the Coast over this time period was implemented. And I'm very grateful for the lessons that were learned here.
I feel that.
Well, and we've been focusing a little bit on the commanders too, but like in addition to all of this over the course of this arc, we've also seen a change in how they're designing cards that are in the 99.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest problems in the early days was like Red's lack of card draw. And they spent over the course of this arc, starting, you know, I Outpost Siege is the card that jumps out at me in terms of like giving Red their kind of quote unquote Phyrexian Arena with Impulse Draw. At this point, it very much like, and I think we've done shows talking about how Red's kind of, that problem's been solved. There's so many different card draw or card advantage options in Red now, and they spent this arc of time working on addressing that. White took a little bit longer, and it's probably maybe still a work in progress.
Oh yeah, it was.
But they've been working on that as well. Like there was an attempt to also shore up some other weaknesses in the format in colors and color pairing. And they got better at doing that along this way too. As they got better at designing commanders and making things work better in the format, they figured out what things in the 99 work really well in the format.
Now, Matt, I have a question about this particular point specifically. And there's a thing that you've said on a couple of past episodes here, and I wonder if this is the moment to interrogate it a little bit further.
Okay.
But you've kind of noted that there was a certain point where it started to feel like Commander, instead of always feeling like an eternal format where, yes, you can't play anything, there was a point where it started to feel a little bit like a rotating format. Was that point here, or was it further on?
I think this is when it kind of not formally started, but when we really started seeing that kind of theory play out, because not only did like the card quality, like we've all pointed out several cards ago in the 99, you had the Fierce Guardianships and all that stuff, but not just the quality of the cards, but the density and the amount of cards. This is when we started seeing a ramp up in supplemental products. So that's when we started seeing a whole bunch, not just very, very powerful cards, but a lot of them coming out where all of a sudden you couldn't really have these low floor role players anymore because they had a high floor role player that was going to do the exact same thing, only better. That was just kind of pushing a lot of those cards out of the format. So I know a lot of the conversation just in the community around this time was like, I still want to play these old cards that I want to play, but I feel like I can't because these new cards are just too good not to play. And that's one thing I think I appreciate a lot about the rules committee, the Commander Advisory Group. I know our friend Olivia Gobert Hicks, she's always talking, just play the cards you want to play. Don't feel pressure on, and especially don't put pressure on yourself to try to play this new card. Play the cards you want to play, no matter how good they are. And that's one sentiment that I've tried to maintain in my deck building. I don't always do a very good job of it, but I try to at least.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel that. And I think I would also agree, specifically because 2019, the Brawl Pecons introducing Arcane Signet is just like, oh, yeah. Well, that's sort of a best in class. Oops. And we started to receive a few more of those cards that felt like best in class. And especially the fact that they were so ubiquitous was also a problem. Like if there's a best in class for a super niche strategy, like, okay, that's kind of like, that's a niche decks need a little bit more extra pump to make them get there. But when a card can really just go just about anywhere, that's where even Wizards of the Coast has been like, stuff like Arcane Signet, that was a mistake. So I agree with your sentiment here that like this was a point where it started to feel like a lot of cards were getting pushed out of the stuff that you could actually feasibly do. But it's an important thing to hold on to, what you were just saying there too, about like, just play what you want. Don't feel pressured, even if the cards are like looming large in some of the ways that they started to here.
Well, let's get into the next phase then. And this is one that all the things that we started talking about in this most recent phase of, we're getting a lot more product, we're getting a lot more legends. This is when it becomes not just like a curve, but like a deluge of just legends. Everything is legendary starting now.
Yeah, the Kaldheim curve or the Kaldheim spike, because we really got a very big difference. I think it was.
I like alliteration, but Dana, you might be the breaking vote here.
Kaldheim curve, I think I'm with you. That's the way to go.
All right, there we go.
Because the set before, we had 17 legends in the Zendikar set that came before it, but then we got 33 legends in Kaldheim that came right after it. And there were more than 70 legends in the Commander Legends set, because Draft Environment, there was more partner experimentation, the monocolored partners there. But yeah, 2021 was where we started to get what we'll call the Deluge era.
Well, and it's just absolutely mind-boggling. We had Dominaria, the first set that we kind of revisited Dominaria, where it was a Legends Matter set. So it's kind of like when we first were in Kamigawa, where, it's kind of got a theme around it of legendary things matter. And we had that again in Dominaria. So we kind of had a reasoning why there were 40 plus legends in Dominaria. And then we went to Zendikar, like, that's a lot of legends for it not being the theme. And then Kaldheim, it's really just where they established the new normal, where everything's going to be legendary. All these signpost commons and uncommons that we used to see, kind of telling people in draft formats, okay, green, white, you probably want to do this strategy. In red, black, you want to do this. All of those suddenly became legendary, and just the number of legendary creatures we got in every single set skyrocketed because of it.
Mm-hmm.
So from this era, the one thing that really stands out at me that changed was the focus in the design of the pre-con decks. A lot of times there was a split focus prior to this, or if the deck had a specific focus, thinking of perhaps the Estrid, the mass deck that had 3 Enchantress commanders, that was a relatively focused deck. But there weren't a ton of cards in that deck necessarily that were really important to maybe that archetype. In this era, we started getting very specifically focused commander decks that were filled with a bunch of new cards that were really powerful in that archetype. And that's the thing we thought we wanted. And I'm not saying we didn't. I think there's a lot of upsides to that. If you were a new player, for example, being able to grab a pre-con that has a really specific theme and a bunch of good cards that, maybe push that theme over the top in terms of winning a game or whatever, that's probably a pretty good thing to have, I think. And additionally, not everyone has a ton of time to brew. So being able to find a lot of those things in a single package is very useful too. The downside that I think nobody really anticipated when we were asking for all of these things is I think now we have a situation where if you have a deck with a certain theme and a precon comes out with that same theme, it's just going to have probably 20 cards in it that are better than the deck that you brewed up. So your choice then becomes either to not run them, in which case you're just running a worse version of the deck, or to run them and have your deck functionally look like the precon that just came out. The brew that you may have been playing with for 5 or 6 years is now going to wind up looking just like a deck that, came out last week. Is that bad? I don't know, but it's definitely a change. That's a new thing that we hadn't experienced before.
Yeah.
To talk about, something that's brand new, we just got a 2-color fairy type of deck from the new Eldraine set with a bunch of really good black and blue fairies in it. So much so that if you were already playing a black-blue fairy deck, you're just going to put almost every one of those fairies in that deck, and you're now running basically that precon. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I personally don't love it, but it's definitely a new thing that we didn't deal with in the past. When a deck came out that maybe had a theme similar to yours, it wasn't one that felt like it supplanted your deck, and I think that's in the era we're in right now. That's what happens.
Yeah. On the one hand, I'm glad that we get fewer Teferi's protections, fewer accidental dockside extortionists,
Sure.
like fierce guardianships, like these chase cards that feel like just about anything can use these. And instead we're getting, like, in this era, we got more of the Hordewing Scobs, where it's just like, oh, this is only going to be useful for zombie decks. Or like New Capenna would be in 2022, like 2021, 2022 is the era we're currently looking at. And so it having Damning Verdict as a card, it's like a wrath that is one-sided if creatures aren't wearing +1 counters, or actually any type of counter. And like I do prefer those to just like, here's the next good wrath that goes everywhere. More Cyclonic Rifts we do not need.
Except for if you are playing white and you're playing a counter deck, you're almost always going to be running Damning Verdict.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's so specifically good in that deck. So yeah, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. But there are unintended consequences of a lot of things that we, and by we I literally mean we in this case, like things that maybe we asked for a lot of years now that we've gotten, and we didn't really realize what that meant until we actually got it.
Well, and so like especially in this era, I think we had like two episodes we've done in the past are coming to mind, because we had one about like the deluge when Kaldheim came out, and we were just like, all right, the number of legends is increasing. That is affecting the way that we build decks, because stuff like clones, for example, they're different now. They don't work as well when you've got like 10 legends just accidentally in your deck. And then we've also done an episode about like, are these decks sort of just like building themselves now because of the hyper specific niche cards that we're getting in precons that we saw in this time? So like, yeah, I feel you, Dana, but also I'm not sure, like it like you said, it's just like I mean, there are some things that we left behind that are good though, so
I struggle to think that these consequences that we're getting, where it's specific answers for specific decks, are worse somehow than, oh, here's a just generally amazing bomb card, and we're getting 7 Cyclonic Rifts a year.
Sure.
And we're getting all these Teferi's protection type of cards. I would 1000% rather get a super specific role player that it just happens to be great in that one deck or one strategy than a deck that you're going to see and it suddenly becomes a 70, like a Great Henge, for example. I would so much rather have cards that aren't Great Henge, even though I love Great Henge. I have in so many decks. But the point is, like, that card is just so good that not only does it just go in every deck, but like it gets expensive too. Everybody wants 5 of those cards.
Yeah.
And it's just so hard. Whereas you get these specific answers and specific powerhouses, that's when the game just gets so much more accessible too, because the cards aren't nearly as expensive.
Yes. Yeah. I fully agree with you. This one, it's a hard pill to swallow, but I do think it's overall better medicine for us, is maybe how I'll phrase it.
Sure.
So I feel you on that. There is at least... there are a few other points that happened in this time slot, though, that I think are important. Like I mentioned New Capenna earlier, and the treasure explosion really does happen in this point in time, and that is worth noting, because like, that was a bit unrestrained, especially around New Capenna, of just like, oh, there's treasures like genuinely just everywhere now. And that is a big shift in the way that we have to interface with like what these little pieces of metal can do to battlefields. But this was also like Commander 2021. I just want to shout out specifically because it was finally a moment in time where they decided that Boros was allowed to have more than just equipment and feather as a personality. And I just appreciate that because like they were trying on white card design for a long time. Dana, you were mentioning like, oh, red impulse draw in the previous era, but here we were still struggling. Like in the last era, they were trying, but like we still got Cartographer's Hawk in the C20 precons and Verge Rangers in the Commander 20 precons. And like in the previous era, they also had marketed Commander Legends as having powerful white cards, but we got stuff like Seraphic Greatsword. Like, I don't think they figured out how to do a Boros until 2021. And I don't think they figured out how to do white particularly until 2022 at last. I think it took them about a decade to like really finally figure out, all right, here's what we need to do with this color in this multiplayer format, finally.
Well, and Mark Rosewater, who has always been very, very transparent in whether it's his blog or his podcast or anything like that, has been very vocal about how they kind of came to the realization that we can't keep kneecapping white because we think it shouldn't be. And they needed to change their perception because their perception suddenly wasn't really becoming the norm anymore. So they had to admit, okay, white just cannot compete anymore unless we push boundaries and we really play around with how we execute what white does. So thankfully, they've been vocal in adapting. And again, this is where we're seeing a lot of the lessons that were learned in those prior eras. And we're really starting to get it. Yes, maybe it took a little bit longer than the typical player would like, but we are at least seeing those results.
And I've said this before, but a thing I also appreciate amidst the deluge is that we no longer get that situation that we had in the years before where like Edgar Markov comes out and now everyone has an Edgar Markov deck because that's the thing that happened. Nowadays, we're getting more legends than we can keep up with, which means when you sit down, you may not know the commanders that you're facing against at all. You may see cards you've never seen before. And even if it does sometimes feel a little flustering that we can't keep up with everything, that newness experience, that is a fresh thing that I have come to really enjoy. Well, fellas, that finally brings us to present day. After all of those, we're now here in 2023, and there is another era for us to define here in present day. Matt, what should we call the present day era, do you think?
I don't know. It's kind of beyond expectations and anything that we can really do. There's no way this universe can comprehend. I don't. Universes Beyond has just been all over the place. That's what jumps out to me, and just so many different ways and so many different ways to interpret that.
Yeah. The Universes Beyond explosion is, I think, what we've decided to call it here. Particularly, I think something that you mentioned before we were recording was that like Baldur's Gate seems to be especially a moment that kind of begins this. Like, we've got a lot of cards from a lot of other IPs that are mixing now into the Magic world. And like technically this was a thing that happened several years prior. Like Walking Dead was not in 2023, but that product did not actually establish a design ethos necessarily. No. Whereas in 2023, we're seeing the Baldur's Gate, the Warhammer, the Transformers, the Lord of the Rings. And that's more of a more common thing, and it will continue to be a more common thing. And that really feels like a new design ethos that is making its way on through in 2023.
Yeah, I think this is also the point in time where they are just printing win conditions for archetypes. They've printed cards. We talked about things like the Damning Verdicts that work really well in a +1 counter stack. But like we're getting cards, if they print an Enchantress deck like they just did, they're going to print 1 or 2 or 3 brand new cards in that deck that will probably win you the game. And that's not something we had really saw in the past. I mean, early days, there weren't win conditions at all, really. And as the game advanced and they printed more Commander stuff, you found more of those cards that did work in that way. And there was some intentionality to that. But like really the last year or so is when we've seen them say, okay, we're going to make this particular deck and we are going to put 2 brand new cards in here that if you are playing this archetype and you have an established board state, there's a really good chance it's going to win you the game or at least kill one player. And that's not a thing we had seen in the past, I think. And it's also, I would argue, what's lent itself to that feeling that like if you have a deck and a precon comes out that kind of mirrors your deck's archetype, you're just going to probably need to run a bunch of those cards to stay caught up. So that's another part of that I think is relatively new.
I mean, I don't know if it's relatively new because it's still pushing the rotating format of Commander that we kind of touched on a little bit. But you are right that it just we're just getting so many cards. It's not just like a card or two or a commander or two, but it's two or three cards per pre-constructed deck that just become these auto. I hate using the term staples, but these almost auto includes for so many different decks, especially if you're playing a specific theme. And it's not just, oh, it's a good board wipe if you're playing decks that care about counters on things. It's just, oh, this card is just like a win condition and it's very easily achieved at the same time.
Specifically, there's a thing here that I think what sets the 2023 and also like honestly also the 2021 and 2022 like that period of time, a thing that stands out differently to me that marks it as a different era from like the fire design of 2019 is that it feels like the powerful commanders that we get here in these days are not powerful because of the fire design that they were like pushed to be hyper powerful. It feels like they are kind of powerful by accident. Like Shorokai was not tested fully, and it was sort of like, oh, I guess that's better than we thought it was, or like we still get powerhouse commanders like Miram, for example, but it feels like since there are so many legends these days, they don't have time to play test and power balance every single one of them that goes out because there are just so many of them. So we get more of those, oh, this is accidentally a whole lot better than necessarily we thought, or this strategy or these commanders are not as good as we thought because there are just so many of them that balancing all of them is no longer possible. So the powerful stuff that we get these days feels to me more like less like a purposeful thing and more like a, listen, we wanted to try and design some fun stuff, and balancing commander, we're going to rely a little bit more on the social end of the format, and players negotiating power levels with each other to really balance that stuff out, because actually trying to balance it in terms of the cards, card design cannot solve a social problem. If people want to do powerful stuff, we're going to leave that to them, and the card designs will just try and make sure that it's fun, but that means we can't test every single thing. That kind of feels to me like a big difference from 2019.
I think that there's a huge, and I know, Dana, you love to bring up this card specifically, but there's a huge signpost for, they just started doing things just to like make sure there's enough text on the card, it feels like, and just kind of like, oh, we're going to also throw this on there. Like, we're going to give it Ward 2 just as a treat.
Right.
But Shelob, Child of Ungoliant, the Golgari colored Shelob, there's so much text on it, and it feels like they could have just stopped with either the top half or the bottom half of that card. And I know that we mentioned this card specifically a lot, but it's kind of a perfect example, I think, that I'm very, very glad you brought it up, Dana, that just this card would have been great with half of the text, and the other half would have been totally forgotten. But I don't know how to put this. It feels like the design team is putting pressure on themselves to make sure that all these cards are powerful instead of just letting the designs speak for themselves. And I know I've said on this podcast a few times, like, I would be so happy to see a simple, elegant design that also happens to be effective. It doesn't need to have death touch and this in order for it to be something that commander players are going to want to play. Make it just something that is going to be fun. It doesn't need all these extra words on there. If they're doing it for flavor reasons, I get that, but at the same time, do you need to make sure that everything is just flavor specific too? And I don't know.
Yeah, well, and the examples that I've invoked when we've had conversations like this in the past, like Tivit was probably intended to be a voting commander because it has this voting ability, but the other words that they put on it are so potent in making so many other types of tokens that it is just not, voting is the least interesting thing about the commander. And it's like, if there had been fewer words on it, then maybe it actually would have done the thing that was intended in the first place. Or I feel like this is also the point where we're starting to get commanders that step on each other's toes. I've mentioned Wolfgar and Ishin. I'm just like, those came out very, very close to each other, and they both double attack triggers. It's weird that we got both of those in such close proximity. Or Celestine and Rodolph are the other examples as well. And it does feel like these commanders are sort of like trying to steal each other's gigs. And I'm just like, I feel like we don't need that. And if like, so that we've got a lot of lessons from previously that are still making themselves very, very well known here as a byproduct of the fact that there is just so much going on.
Yeah, when you're doing two commanders that are so similarly designed like that, I hate to say this, but like they're just recycling ideas too soon, and just part of that to me is just there's so much pressure on. We need so many different legendaries that they're starting to recycle ideas, and I know that the team is so good at their job. They're able to come up with new designs, but I think this is Hasbro talking, not Wizards of the Coast talking, when just we're doing the same thing over and over again. We just have to meet this quota of legendary creatures. So of course they're going to run out of ideas eventually.
Yeah, Joey touched on the increase and how that affects increase in cards they make and how that affects testing. When they're printing 10 times as many cards, I guarantee they have not devoted 10 times as many hours into testing these cards.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a better way to phrase it than I did. I love that. Yeah.
And so things are absolutely going to slip through. However, we've also seen a change in management at WotC, where Hasbro is calling a lot of shots in a way that they weren't calling 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Which means there's a lot of pressure to sell packs.
Yeah.
And while mistakes definitely happen at a higher rate, and by mistake, I just mean like things that weren't tested the way they thought they would be tested, I also think there's a definite intentionality to printing commanders that are very strong that will replace something that you already had. It's like a planned obsolescence kind of thing almost. No one was confused about how powerful Miriam was. I don't think like that was a misunderstanding, that was an absolute bomb. That's a card that's going to make you upgrade your dragon deck to a Miriam deck. I think there's for all the accidental things that probably happened that shaped the format, I think there's definitely an intentionality there too, where like they want you to go buy more packs in a way that perhaps WotC wasn't too concerned about a decade ago. They obviously want to sell product, but there's a cynicalness, I think, to it that maybe wasn't there once upon a time.
Now, there's a note that Matt made before we began the show that I feel like we need to mention here.
Okay.
Just like kind of going back to like the deluge of it all, since we're still touching on that note, Matt had noted that we had more legendary creatures revealed on the first day of Wilds of Eldraine previews than we did in all of Ravnica Allegiance. And honestly, like
Yep.
that just makes me laugh a lot. It's just like, oh yeah, we're in a new reality. But there's a thing in this era, especially since we called it the Universes Beyond explosion. And I think that we actually might have breezed past that a little bit too quickly, because I think it's important for us to say something a little bit further about the Universes Beyond explosion. And like yes, there's some Hasbro doing the influence on the way that design is going these days, and that is some bitter boots for a lot of players who've been around for a while and who miss some of the eras that we talked about at the very beginning of this show. And I think to some extent or another, all three of us fall into different parts of that argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With that said, the absolute reality, the genuine, just absolute reality of this is that a lot of these other things, the Doctor Who's, the upcoming Final Fantasies, the Lord of the Rings that just happened, like Lord of the Rings made big news among so many nerd spaces. Mm-hmm. They're doing this because it is fundamentally bringing more players into the game. And I'm not mad about that. Like, cynical or whatever or not, whatever the intentions, if people don't like the absolute reality is that we're getting more people who play Magic, and that's nothing but a good thing. That specific thing is a thing I am happy to focus on and to applaud, that more people will be playing Magic as a result of some of these things. I don't necessarily need to be a fan of all of the IPs that are crossing over into Magic, and if people don't like it, I get it. But whether it's motivated just by profit or whatever, however people want to say it, I have more people that I can play Magic against, and that rocks.
Yeah, selfishly, I want to think that Lord of the Rings was only ever going to be the set like that, because Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite IPs. It's one of it is my favorite set of all time. I can just comfortably say that. But at the same time, I need to realize like the joy that set brought to me, and how excited I was, and how much it reinvigorated me, honestly, for the game. Doing that with other IPs, doing that with Assassin's Creed or Fallout or whatever, it's going to give that exact same feeling to so many other people. And I love Final Fantasy. I've played every Final Fantasy game growing up, and so maybe that'll happen again. I don't know, but I need to remind myself too, because I for some reason in the back of my mind, I think it makes Lord of the Rings feel less special, but it's still special to me, and that's ultimately kind of what should count.
Well, Joey made the point about how like you're happy that all these new players are coming in. I actually am as well, but let's say I wasn't. That wouldn't change anything, right? Like, the reality is this is happening whether we like it or not. They're going to continue to print a ton of product. They're going to continue to print Universes Beyond. That's just what's going to happen. So you may not like it, and maybe that's the kind of thing that's going to make you leave, and that's unfortunate, I guess, but it's not going to stop. So like that's what I've come to on this. The things I like or dislike, that's a rock rolling down a hill, and I'm not going to stand in front of it. So like I can either embrace that change or not, but the change doesn't care.
Yeah, the change doesn't care. Ooh, Dana, that was a mic drop moment for me. I freaking love that. Yeah, no, that's a really good thing, because like if new people are coming to this game and the first thing that they encounter at a game store or whatever is someone who's mad at Final Fantasy whatever's, like that's not a great environment for them to walk into. And like I'd rather be the type of person who's welcoming.
Yeah.
Like I want to be welcoming to the person who saw this thing, had never played Magic before, and they were like, Warhammer? I love that game. I want to play this thing now. And now I've got another opponent that I can play really enjoyable games against. Cool. That like I just like happy or unhappy about it. As you said, Ginge doesn't care. And also I need to be welcoming to that person, because their experiences are going to matter so much more than me being bitter about anything. Like no one's impressed by how much anyone hates something, you know? So like being welcoming would be a big priority for sure. So yeah, I love the way you phrase that.
So I wonder for you two, because I'm plumb out of any predictions for what anything in the future is going to look like, because if you would have asked me in 2015 what card design would look like, or just told me this is what it's going to look like, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said these are made up cards that like will never exist. Do you two have any predictions for what we might be seeing in the future? Are we going to see design going the same way as it is now, or is it going to shift a little bit? How do you think it's going to shape up in the near future?
The next era. I don't know. Dana, do you have something or?
I mean, we're definitely not going to see less Universes Beyond, I don't think. I think if anything, that's just going to ramp up. I think we're going to continue to see the trend we've seen right now, where they are going to, for sales reasons, they're going to want you to have to buy cards to keep your deck updated, to keep up with the decks that are out there that people are buying. So like if we're playing a Selesnya Enchantress deck, I think that the intent is to make you want to have to buy cards or buy that Selesnya Enchantress precon so you can upgrade your deck so it can hang. I think that's just how capitalism works, and I think that we need to like just understand that's what's going to be the thing moving forward. And maybe you are just no longer, like maybe me, speaking of me particularly, maybe I'm not going to be able to have a specifically super unique deck anymore, because as soon as they print a Golgari Death Touch deck, it's going to have 15 cards in it that like I'm going to have to put in my Golgari Death Touch deck, or it can't keep up. I think we're going to see more and more of that as they move forward, because having really specific decks makes sense. And from a sales standpoint, I get why they would do that. I get why they want to make you have to continue to be involved in the product to make you keep functioning as a consumer. I just think we're going to see more of the things we've already seen, and it's probably going to escalate.
Interesting. So I think I've got my potential prediction, and actually it kind of goes back to the very first thing that we talked about, where Matt, you said that you had a pre-EDH deck. As things swell and swell and swell, I don't think this is a balloon that bursts or whatever, but I do think that something that big, like a player base maybe cannot sustain. Commander is currently the form of multiplayer Magic, and it cannot possibly be all things to all people. So if there are people who are craving more of the nostalgia of the pre-DH, what we'll get is more of a fragmentation of like, all right, this is going to be a different subsection of stuff. And I would anticipate more in that vein. Of it just like, oh, here's going to be, I would foresee a more variant era, I guess is the way that I would phrase it, of like different ways to engage with this, a little bit more experimentation on the player side to see if there are different things that we can do. Since we've got so much of this pie, let's see if we can make some different little slices for it and enjoy it in a couple of different ways rather than having to stomach all of it all at once. That's, I think, my potential future prediction.
I think nostalgia-driven formats, or just point-driven formats too. I know Canadian Highlander has a really good point system for a lot of the high-power cards. I think that might creep up in popularity if we hit a certain breaking point. So that is a really good point. I mean, that's kind of why pre-EDH came to be, is because it was such a nostalgia-driven format that people just kind of gravitated towards it because they wanted to get away from everything that was happening currently. So that is a really good point. I really do think that might see more rise.
Yeah, and we'll see. Like this, this has been a really fun, like, history lesson kind of thing. Like going back through those different eras of design and seeing like different moments in time, different products that began to influence the stuff that would come later. I think it's fascinating. I think it's been really, really interesting to see those things. And honestly, we were just talking about the player design. We didn't even talk about how, like, oh, you know, EDHREC became a thing, or game nights became a thing, and that also influences player behavior too, and our deck building stuff too. So, like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to dig into that I think is like just wonderful, and it's been great going down memory lane with you guys, and to also you know, figure out how things came to be this way, because regardless of how things seem to be, it's freaking flourishing. So like,
right, yeah,
I'm happy about that, and it's been cool to see how we got there because it's flourishing.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some pretty monumental changes in how this game functions since this podcast started.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see where it goes, you know, where the game is 300 more episodes from now, considering where it was 300 ago.
Yeah. And I also, actually, Matt, I have one more prediction. Another thing in the future that will happen
that
is,
you'll get the segue
Joey,
for Challenge of Stats, because that's not going to happen.
You
either.
stole my joke. That's exactly what I was going to say. All right, never mind. That era's not happening because Matt won't even let me get my own punchlines. God. Brilliant.
You telegraphed that more than Alexander Graham Bell, even though he didn't really use the telegraph because he used the phone. It doesn't matter. Either way, I knew what you're going for, and it's not going to happen. Just give it up.
I'm so angry at you. That's amazing. All right. Well, you know what segue I can do is for the outro of the episode. So listeners, let us know what you think are the different defining moments of the past many years of Commander. We really want to hear from you on this one. And with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. I'm tempted to not ask Matt.
You can find me at Mathimus55 on pretty much any social media platform, whatever it is. It's the same handle, Mathimus55. And don't forget, we do stream over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast. We have guests on whenever we stream. It's fun time. It's always a good time. Yeah, make sure you tune in.
And Dana, how about you?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me online at Joseph M. Schultz. I just started Instagram. Check me out over there. I don't know how it works, but it's fun to find out. You can also find the cast at EDHRECast on all of those online places too. Plus, if you got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for assisting me with the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.